And we're live with our 240th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on social media, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on social media. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another fabulous episode of Absolute AppSec. Super excited to be here to chat with Ken. As always, we had a great week last week. I went all over the Midwest. Ken, on the flip side, came to Omaha. We've decided that travel to and from Omaha is just cursed. I don't know how else to put it, but that's the way that it is. But had a super effective training session, talked about all things AI, how to use LLMs in the secure code review process. Actually, in the process of that, I think both Ken and I figured out some new things so that those sections of the course are going to continue to improve as we use this moving forward, especially playing with the different models. And I mean, we're going to get into that here shortly. As far as upcoming events, we have DEF CON trainings, a couple of different opportunities for DEF CON trainings, right? If you look at training.defcon.org, we are scheduled to be at, let's see, I think there's 3 different opportunities that are available there, Ken. Whoops. Wow. I put up a link without .org on it. So that's how my day is going. So we have DEF CON trainings in DC in June, right? The end of June. Yeah, June, like 27th and 28th. And we will be including the AI bits. We've got to get the outline updated on the site itself with the DEF CON folks, but we will be including that there. So there's that. There's the DEF CON Las Vegas, the ones that are associated just after the conference, after DEF CON. We're there on a yearly basis. So the Las Vegas trainings, and then I think it's going to be November or December, DEF CON Paris just got moved. So it was supposed to be this month. I think we were supposed to be there in like a week or 2, but it's just been moved to later in the year. So if you're looking for an opportunity, this is a great place to do it. I don't think we've done trainings in DC actually ever, to be honest with you, Ken, even though you live there or you're in the Northern Virginia area. I don't think we've ever done. Oh, yes, we have, because we did it at AppSec USA or Global AppSec DC or whatever.
Right. We did, yeah.
The name of that is, right? Like at this point, right? But we did that 1 year, but that was in 2018 or 2019, right? That was a while ago. That was pre-pandemic days. So like this is the first time that we'll be back. If you're looking for an opportunity, this is when you have it. We have a couple of other submissions and for different conferences as well. So, watch this space for other opportunities. But the European one, especially, I'm excited for. I'd love to get back over there. And then we're also looking at opportunities to get into the Asia Pac region or APAC region, whatever you call it, back down to Australia. Shout out to all of our good friends down in Australia, and just it's been too many years, so like we're gonna prioritize that and make that happen this fall. Yeah, on the flip side, I'm gonna be at B-Side Salt Lake City this weekend, and we also are having a happy hour. Let's post that happy hour link, Ken. I don't know if you've got it available to you or if you need
I'm finding it. Don't worry about it. I'll find it. Yeah.
Okay.
RSA
if you're going to be at RSA on, we're going to be doing a happy hour. I think it's May 6th. So it's the Monday evening. Ken and I will be there. It's going to be sponsored by Redpoint and Dry Run. Surprise, surprise, as well as Impart Security. And we will be, just looking for, if you're going to be at RSA, it's early in the week. Would love to see you. We're going to have some, at least socks. We'll probably have Crocs again to give away, do a raffle again. And would love to see you at the conference there. We did this last year at RSA and are looking to do it again.
I'm going to put this only in Slack though.
Okay.
The RSVP link, just so that it's not, out there. I don't know, just give it to our community first kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, you know what I mean? Like in the Slack. Uh, sorry, I'm trying to actually work on two different screens here. So, uh,
Multitasking is hard, is what we've
oh
discovered.
shoot. Hopefully I didn't. Oh crap. Hold on. Yes. This is
Is that
exactly how you said. This is how my day's going. I'm like, yeah, that's about right. It's been a slog, you know. Uh,
yeah.
but yeah. Cool. I got to
That's
make
okay.
sure.
So I did want to give so I was talking about conferences, like we were at Cactus Con, and then I also went to no, Cactus Con, freak, man. I like all the names are running together. We were at Kernel Con last week, teaching at Kernel Con, attended the day of the conference there. And then I actually went to Milwaukee and spoke at CypherCon. And was pretty impressed, right? Like with both of them. I mean, we've been going to KernelCon for a few years now. The team there is amazing. That conference is really good. Feels like a really good regional conference. Great support staff. We love training there. And the talks are fabulous too, right? Like they would do a really good job of curating interesting security talks. And then I attended CypherCon just for their second day. Like I kind of split the days between the two. Spoke at CypherCon. I was actually really impressed with CypherCon as well. It's a little bit bigger than KernelCon is, probably 2 to 3 times the size. It's at a conference center, a little bit larger of a venue, and but again, like really good regional conferences. The talks, there was a lot of at both of the conferences, there's a lot of AI talks going on right now. It's interesting what people are trying to accomplish with LLMs and all that stuff. But well run. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't recommend either of them more, right? Like they both feel like mini DEF CONs, I want to say, like really good research that people are presenting and actually cutting edge research as well. It's not just, I don't know if you're finding this, Ken, but I'm seeing more and more like original research come out of like the smaller community conferences, or I guess like regional conferences that used to be almost main stage DEF CON Black Hat style stuff. Especially in the security conferences space, I feel like definitely there still is kind of the premiere that happens at DEF CON and at Black Hat, and I'd even say DEF CON more nowadays. But the regional conferences, some of the research that's coming on there might not be as polished, but it's just as effective as what I'm seeing at DEF CON. I don't know, what were your thoughts Kernel Con wise this year?
I always love the conference. I think it's culturally really really yeah, great talks, great folks. Also, like it's kind of cool because this same folks keep coming. There's like a core group of folks that keep coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice whenever we're roaming the hallways, we get to see some familiar faces. That's usually at the, I of course still get stuff out of the technical talks, but hallway con is like priority for me. So I always
Mm-hmm.
enjoy just catching up with people. Also, I like Omaha. I do
Yeah.
like it. I don't like the airport. That always seems to be an issue. Well, not the airport, but the flying in and out. But yeah, besides that, jokes aside, it's a great town. It's got lot to. It's actually pretty hip. It's got like a lot of good restaurants, and yeah. So I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
everything from a technical perspective to the venue to the people. Can't complain. Can't complain. And as you know, I did like 2 weeks of straight travel. Like I went, so that was fun because that was a dovetail of a trip. And I told you I basically went. I flew out to compete at Pans. It's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu competition in Florida. Then I came back from that, and as like I think even before I landed, it was time to check in for my next flight, and then went on vacation for a few days. Came back from that. As I was getting home from the trip, it was time to check in for the next flight, which was to Omaha, and then did Omaha. So it was just 2 weeks of just madness. So it's nice to kind of feel settled again, I guess. Yeah, yeah, and I liked teaching too. That was fun, especially with the new Gen AI bits that we've added in, sprinkled into the course to speed up code reviews. Um, yeah, I don't know, just overall pretty great.
Sweet. Good. Yeah. Well, come join us at our next adventure then, right? Like wherever that happens to be. We'll post here. I mean, like I said, I'll be at B-Side Salt Lake City. That's this Friday. That's a one-day conference just in Salt Lake. I'll be speaking, but they asked me to slim my talk down from an hour to a half hour. And so I'm like, crap, I'm too long-winded for this anymore, right? Like, is that how I know I'm getting old? Yeah, whatever.
Dude, none of my talks are easily put under an hour anymore because there's just so much. Yeah, there's just so much to add and say about certain things these days. So
yeah,
we're like the state of where we're at and the history behind everything and all that. Those are geared. Those are usually the talks I'm giving these days. I look back and I look forward.
To look back and I mean, the one that I'm giving on this Friday, it's the same one that I've given at a couple different places, but it's just like a AppSec journey style one, right? Like what I've seen over the years, what we're getting better at, or like what we think we're doing better than what we did years ago, even though it's all the same, that kind of thing. So, along those lines, there was a couple of topics that were going in Slack that I actually wanted to bring up. Not necessarily the article, Ken, but I know Eric brought this up. This was last week, and there was quite a bit of discussion around it, right? But there was this talk about how discussions and vulnerability chats and just like industry posts, right, aren't as intensive, or there's not as much as there was 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I guess, right? Eric's point was like, oh, he's in a whole bunch of different Slacks and Discord chats, and quote, the total volume of discussion about vulns and AppSec across all of them is about 10% of the total discussions of any one of the hacker chats I was in 20 years ago. Close quote. I wondered what your take on that was, right? I know there was, like it went back and forth, and there's a whole big old long thread from Cole as well, about actually, discussion threads and putting things out there. What is your thought? Like, are you seeing the same sorts of kind of degradation of the discussions, or do you feel like it's better? Like, where do you feel like things are at as far as like community discussion of application security topics? And I know we're biased because we're in, like, we have a podcast right now that we're talking about application security stuff. But how do you feel like that is?
Oh, I mean, I guess I have a few. Well, I mean, so like we've definitely had in our Slack, links posted for interesting technical vuln breakdowns, or I think that's the idea, right? It's like technical. Yeah, it's got to be like pretty code centric and pretty vulnerability focused and have technical details. So I mean, we still see those. I don't know. I still see those articles, and I don't know about Twitter. Twitter is a mix of things, but I think like it also, the 25 years ago, we were pretty new to the whole thing, right? Finding software bugs, even knowing what they are, what categories they are, what categories to put them in, and those categories were just sort of evolving. Whereas these days, I think we've once in a while we find something kind of novel, but they've been fleshed out for a bit. And not to say that people are like fatigued on it or anything like that. Just there's I actually I'm of another mind on that as well, which is like we started with being pretty focused on vulnerabilities in code, but it's really evolved, especially like even AppSec or even outside of AppSec. It's really evolved into like larger discussions about all kinds of different things, everything from like soft skills to the ancillary kind of things you do as part of a product security program to I mean, all kinds of different things in general that aren't necessarily always technical, though they are valuable, they are relevant to our field, but they're not necessarily maybe like down into the code. I Personally, though, on a personal level, I like a mix. I do appreciate a mix. There's only so many times I can look at a cross-site scripting bypass or something of that nature before I'm like, all right, cool. But there are some pretty novel ones we've seen too, which we talk about on the podcast when those come up. I don't know. It's probably a mixture of things, and maybe it's just the medium as well. Who knows? Like maybe say Slack's more conducive to one type of topic conversation versus maybe Twitter or Mastodon or whatever else people are using. So the answer is I don't know. It's probably a mixture of factors. Nothing here bothers me about it. I think it's more interesting to just see what people are interested in the moment. I think. Well, yeah. I mean, what do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts on that discussion? I had briefly passed through it, but it's been a whirlwind of activity the last couple of weeks. I just
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's part of why I wanted to bring it up, right? Is, like, I feel like it was partial, like back in the day, there was just so few sources that everybody kind of went to the same places, right? Like we've talked about kind of like, where research is actually presented, like if you go back to my early days of BBSing, there was like Frack and there was like 2600 and that was it, right? Like from a security perspective. And so, of course, everyone was in those or was reading those articles. That was where the discussion points happened. Your local BBS. That was it, right? Like, and then as things got wider, like we expanded out from there. There's a reason why everyone shows up to DEF CON, right? Like, it was the place to be to talk about security stuff, and you didn't have other forums. And I think what we're seeing is a splintering of that, right? So X or Twitter for a while was like the place where you dropped your research, and that has gone, or that was the place that discussions were happening, and that has dropped off a little bit. I mean, there's still as good research that's happening there, and you could still curate those feeds just fine. But a lot of that other professional discussion has moved to other forums. I mean, you see the proliferation of Discord and Slack into like very specific niche topics. And I think that's what, I mean, Stefan was staying logical, was saying, he came in and said 20 to 25 years ago, there was very little professional chatter to be had. It was mostly like, oh, the vulnerability stuff and the very specific like technical bits. Whereas now it's basically dominated by, in all forms, by professional discourse, to the point where some of that actual quality chatter is missing, right? We don't necessarily get into the technical bits as much. So like, I feel like it's still there. It just takes curation, which is difficult, right? And which takes time to figure out where those people are to have those discussions. And yeah, so I guess that's where I'm at, because I feel like we get a fair amount of feedback on the Absolute AppSec channel, as well as like the other forums like TLDRSec and some of the things that we monitor on a daily basis, but we can't monitor everything. So we're very dependent on, within our group or within Absolute AppSec or some of those other channels that we're in, people posting information that's relevant. And that definitely drives the discussion. I mean, the wider like industry stuff always gets posted, whether that's the XZ stuff that happened in the last, couple of weeks, or, big breaches, we will hear about those through multiple different channels. And I find myself not monitoring X or Twitter as much as I used to for that sort of industry news because of those things. And then on the flip side, right, we've got like LinkedIn and kind of the professional side of things that have happened. But to Cole's point, right, from a content and actually putting things out there, Twitter always felt a little bit more ephemeral, right? Even though it was recorded over time, but the discussion would move on and we wouldn't worry about past tweets quite as much, right? They just wouldn't surface. Whereas posting something to LinkedIn or to a blog or whatever else feels like there's more scrutiny on you. And it's harder to put yourself out there, right? Especially with imposter syndrome, and what you're saying, right? Like, so I mean, I guess I don't know. Like, I don't know if I necessarily agree that there's not as much discussion. I think it's just moved into different spaces, and at times it can feel like it's harder to find. I think that's where I'm going with it.
Yeah, I see this sentiment a lot about being worried to publish public thoughts and being like, oh, this won't be valuable. But it's like there's a lot of people at this point, either in cybersecurity or looking to get into cybersecurity, or somehow it relates to their job in the moment. And you never know, that simple blog post you think might be too whatever basic might be valuable. I think it's a little wild that Cole had mentioned there was a group of people that asked for an OG form,
Mhm.
for 10 years, or to ban people with less than 10 years rather of AppSec experience, which is nuts. I know plenty of people who have been under 10 years and are incredible. Some of the best people I've worked with were new to the field. That's silly. I think that's silly, but I didn't even know this was an issue. Really, like this wasn't something I don't know, man. Like just I don't know. I just didn't even realize this was kind of a thing, or an issue. I kind of expected more chatty in the modern day. Use Chat GPT to model their persona. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I don't
Anyway,
know.
it was
Yeah,
an interesting one, right? Like I just kind of wanted to get your take on it because, yeah,
I've been
yeah.
traveling. I've been super quiet, and sorry to everybody in Slack. Like it's just been a lot. But yeah. Uh,
Okay. Well,
cool.
which one of these articles
Which
do you want to? Yeah. Where do you want to go?
I don't even know.
Well, maybe. Okay. So we were talking code review. Let's talk about that from um, Bounce Security that was actually in Slack, and we've done a couple of. Here, I'm going to post it here.
Oh yeah, this is a good one. I like this. This is from I think Josh Grossman shared
Yep,
this, right?
Josh, and it's Josh that it's his article. So I'm going to
Oh, sweet.
repost it in there because we're going to talk about it, right? Um,
Actually,
and
and thank you, Josh. You gave me a couple more patterns to look for
yeah,
in my
it did.
product. So I appreciate that. Actually, believe it or not. Seriously,
So
I mean that
yeah,
genuinely. So thank you, Josh.
let me share that really quick. Right, I'm going to share it here on the video as well. Okay, so this is related to the previous article, when safe is bad and the unsafe is safe, right? Um, I like this is a pet peeve of mine, right, from framework developers in and of itself, right? Like the use of the terms like safe when flagging something, or right, like I always use the example of React's dangerously set inner HTML versus using a term like safe, because it is very descriptive. Safe in and of itself is just a nebulous word that you're not quite sure what it's doing to the content, if it's making it safe or it's making it unsafe, and vice versa, unsafe, right? Like it's just too nebulous without digging into documentation or actually doing further research. So developers will throw it on there even though it may have an unintended effect, right? And so, Josh had his first article in that, and then the second one, when safe is worse than you thought, right? Um, before we dive into it, though, I know you and I we're talking about code review all the sides. This is digging into specifics of Prism ORM and how it handles SQL injection. What were your initial thoughts on this?
Well, so there's four function names called out. There's like query raw, execute raw, and then unsafe versions of those same naming conventions. This is not the first time I've come across this. One of the things I talk about, like we talk about in the course, but I talk about personally an experience that I had was a very frustrating template language that had very poor documentation. And in the same vein as this, it sort of had pointed to a function as saying like, well, it didn't say safe, but it was something along those lines. But it didn't really, it didn't document in many cases where the operators were actually still unsafe. For instance, um, didn't document well or at all really the various ways that you could invoke those functions that were vulnerable. uh, one of the solutions, in case you're curious of how to solve that, for folks listening, one technique I use, I tend to use cross-site scripting strings and then actually build a template file and put each individual operator, like those strings inside of each individual operator, to see which one actually triggers, to see if any of them really trigger. I do that now because of a result of this very, very poor documentation. The naming convention of safe or unsafe, you know, we've seen safe used in such poor ways. Like, well, we are saying safe as in you assume the user input is safe, like for instance, which is just
Yeah.
nonsense. It's just so counterintuitive. But that's not really even necessarily the where it stops, right? It's when documentation doesn't really call things out and explain it well,
Mhm.
you can either it's
What?
inherently unsafe or not, or it can be used in an unsafe way. Um, yeah, those are some serious pet peeves, and I mean they're more than pet peeves. They lead to breaches. You know, they lead to
Yeah.
huge bug bounty costs and incident response uh, scenarios.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's where I go with it, right? Like it's for framework developers, any of you that are out there that are listening, right? Like you want your framework to be self-documenting, right? Like, so hence the reason why dangerously set inner HTML. Like it's obviously like you're doing something that's like, and I can't like be too concerned about this, right? Like query parameter unsafe. It still is a little bit nebulous, but I mean, from a SQL injection perspective, anytime like you and I talk about this, right? Like in the course, anytime that we see something like raw, we're going to key off of it because it's you're writing raw SQL queries. So string interpolation, even if it is considered to be safe, and Josh is right to call that out and to actually test it out here, right, based on what is going on in the documentation because the feeling that you get, especially when you see the unsafe versions of this, is that, oh, as long as I use this one, no matter how I use it, it's going to be safe, which is not always the case, right? Like the way that you build your queries is important, right? In any injection scenario, whether it is content injection or XML or SQL injection, and in this case, SQL injection, definitely, right? And that, and I appreciate the level that he went to here. And this is one of the places where I think we'll start to discover more like um, more vulnerabilities or more vulnerable ways to use things, right, over time, especially as you use AI to build kind of these tests or do what you're doing, Ken, when you talk about the content injection and just like building a page, trying different things out to see what happens. And that's exactly what Josh does in the article, right? Like he pulls in, he's using a query raw, which is supposed to be the safe version, building out SQL with untrusted input, right? Just using or 1 = 1 as the example. And then realizing that, like, even though it's a safe method, that is actually interpolating and SQL injection is happening. Now, right, like that being said, right, like some sort of a SAS tool or an AST parser would probably catch this as SQL injection. And if we look at that, the way that the SQL string is being built, this is why. Because we're using string interpolation there, and we're just passing it um, all in, right? We're building this SQL string, and we're just appending untrusted input to the SQL statement in and of itself. Sorry, what you're going to say?
No, I was going to say, even if the SAS tool does flag it, like what there's always that possibility that somebody, like if you ever a dedicated AppSec pro, I'm sure they can dig in and figure this out. But if you're just giving it to your developers, right, they may look at the documentation. They may just, like, if you have a security champion or just, I don't know, just overwhelmed in security, or developers like review their own results, this might trip them up. This might be like, don't worry about it, right? It could still even
It's
be
safe.
flagged, but
Yeah.
ignored in some
Yeah.
scenario. And
Well, and
yeah.
I mean, you think about an AST
And
parser
then
too, right?
thankfully
Like
Josh put out this
you've got,
article.
yeah.
In
Yeah,
that
exactly.
case,
Because
no
now we
cutting
know
edges.
framework nuances, right? Like you always have to do your research with the ORM that's being used, and this is why. Um, but like you're right, though, from an AST or like a SAS tool perspective, this may actually get cleaned out because they have the concept of like the clean functions, right? that these are the functions that actually do away with input validation problems. And query raw is probably labeled as such if it's been analyzed, or like they're taking the developer documentation as truth, right? So it could very well be that it won't necessarily call this out, just because it is actually running through that clean function that's there. But
I think the old,
yeah. What?
I think the underlying cause here was the use of template. It's like, I forget what it's called, like template strings, or not that. Sorry, not template strings, template tags or something. I don't know. It's down in the article somewhere lower.
Yeah.
But I guess that's the underpinning function that is the root cause of this. If I read it right, just to like close out the loop on the kind of the technical details. I don't know. Maybe I hallucinated that.
Nope, you didn't. Because each of these examples is all vulnerable, because it's actually maybe this one isn't. But you can read through the article to actually see if you are using an ORM, though. This is what this is the level of detail that you probably want to get to. If anything, anything triggers your gut response, right? As far as like, wow, that looks weird. It should, right? So here's the example where query, like, you should be using the $1 parameter, and then passing that in the query values separately from the input string in and of itself, right? So yeah.
No, if I reread the article, though, I think it's like, well, yeah. By the way, so this is why it's really nice when people post articles, because now these framework nuances could be known, or in this case, the library nuance can be known to more than just Josh. So it's helpful. And Josh has the distinction now of feeding ChatGPT's knowledge base and every other LLM's knowledge base
that's out there. Yay! It got scanned.
Now when people ask questions, they can be like,
yeah, granted, exactly. It won't be until GPT's 5 or 6 until it's actually there. But eventually it'll make it into AI's knowledge base, and we'll be good. So kudos to Josh for putting that one out there.
Yeah, thanks for doing that.
Yeah. So make sure you're doing your research on ORMs. Yeah.
I saw you posted a GitHub advisory on that XZ package. Now, this is one that I have the high level of what went on, but I unfortunately have not. So I've read a couple. My knowledge is pretty thin. Like, I read a couple articles on how they, like specifically on how they social engineered themselves into the contributor world there, and then became trusted and did some innocuous things, and over time did some not innocuous things. And then, there was some weird, funky timelines on some of it where they like disappeared for a little while, then came back. And then I believe it might have been Eric who was talking or saying like, how does that, and I don't think he was the only one. I think there were folks questioning, like, how does that correlate? How does being off for a while and coming back correlate to clearly a nation state team of hackers trying to backdoor this package? There were also some other interesting thoughts. One thing that someone said that hit, I don't know, I'm just inundating you. I know I need to pause for a second, but I'm going to say this last thing and then I'll pause, which is someone brought up a really fun thing that made me laugh, which is that thankfully we don't update these types of packages so often. Like, literally not updating was the one thing that saved people, which is so funny, because it's like, you can't win in security. It's like, you need to patch all the time, but if you patch all the time, you might patch in a backdoor.
You might get a backdoor, and so you're only safe because you didn't upgrade your operating system in this situation. And yeah. Okay, so I posted it there.
You can't win in security.
Yeah. So shout out to Greg Ford in Slack for actually calling this article out. Like, I posted the GitHub advisory because we hadn't talked about XZ yet on the podcast. I figured we should at least, it's a software supply chain issue, right? Like, we are wholly dependent on the software that we consume, the libraries that we consume in our applications, as we're building out custom code, right? Like we just are, right? Like most of the code in our applications is not actually developed by us. It's developed by a third party. We know this. We've addressed this multiple times. But Hunted Labs here, again, shout out to Greg for posting this, actually has a really good article on analysis of the user that actually was trying to, that inserted the backdoor into XZ. And let me see. Maybe I'll present that really quick here. And we don't know who this, G10 is or whatever it is. But it's really interesting to dig into their GitHub history because everything's on GitHub nowadays, right? All these public packages. We know that, it's a watering hole attack. Everybody's going to these same places. And, this specific developer had a whole bunch of just private activity, targeted a few different open source projects previously before actually getting access to XZ. And one of the things that they did was it's typical like con man activity, right? Like confidence man, where they build up confidence. They were actually submitting PRs. They were doing good things up until they decided to do something bad, right? And XZ in and of itself could have been way worse, specifically because of what you were saying, that not everything actually updated to the version that had the backdoor in it. And it was caught very quickly by the open source community that something was off with the actual push. But it's interesting to see how he gained confidence and actually gained access to this ability to push XZ to a production version that had his backdoor in it, right? So the dependency downloader, like missing some checks, doing some stuff, disappearing for a little bit. This doesn't mean that it's all the same person. It could just be an account that is used by a nation state. There's definite opinions about that. I'm not here to, go one way or the other, since it does feel like an activity that a nation state would take. But it is also a little, it's very public for that to be the case, right? Yeah.
This has been probably one of the most effective ways. There's two ways I've always thought about if I wanted to plant a backdoor in a widely distributed system. And the most effective ways I could think of, number one, were this type of slow roll your social engineering sort of activities and gain trust over a lengthy period of time. Play the low and slow patient game. That to me seems like, because the other one that I thought about is obviously finding issues inside of security issues that allow you to push code arbitrarily or otherwise get your code snuck in on like a SCM style platform. But even in that case, how long before that goes undetected, right? So not as effective in my mind, even with like some undisclosed vulnerability in the SCM platform, as like a slow roll social engineering attack. So this to me is the way that I would, if you were to ask me, like, you've got 3 years to get this done, this is how I would do it. It makes a lot of sense. I've seen people say they make assumptions that like a lot of major open source contributors are doing this, and I'm like, I don't know about that. I mean, there's realistic paranoia, and there's that, but and also, I don't know what that means. That are we talking like what percentage of open source contributors are we talking about? I don't think that's, if that were true, that would I guess we wouldn't have open source software. So I don't agree with that, but I do think there's probably a number of bad actors out there that we're. And how do you walk me through? I don't know if you want to go through this exercise, but I'm like, how would you even detect this from like I'm not convinced you could. I'm not convinced you could. I don't know.
What do you mean detect it?
Well, right? I'm not. I don't. Yeah, like detect in the sense of detect that this is a person that's going down this path. Like, how do you?
You don't.
What are the markers for that? Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is like there's indicators of, right, like, okay, they're coming from a place, they're, fairly unknown entity, but everybody is as they start out, right? Like, so we give people the benefit of the doubt, but some of the things that he starts to do, right, like, disabling like functions that do the OSS fuzz, right? Like, the fuzzing attacks that would probably have seen some of this going on, changing build
Disabling
scripts.
security tools.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that that's actually going on, right? Yeah. So he's busy disabling tools and setting up his software supply chain tech. Um, Shoots down the idea merge mirror, whatever, right? And then he bumps it, right? Like he finally, where's it at? I'm trying to read through it, on the fly here, right? When he adds the obfuscated code again, this is one of those big red flags. Is, hey, something pops in there, and granted, it's under like test files, but it's like this, strange like obfuscated code that's already in XZ format. Um, that is, I mean, it's distributed with, and he does a pretty good job of like hiding it in plain sight in these test files, right? Like, because for XZ you would expect there to be XZ test files for exploding and like doing other things. And then, yeah, eventually it's
This
found,
was
right? Like, I think it only lives for a month or so.
to Jeremy Long's credit. Jeremy Long gave a talk, and I think we mentioned on the podcast that back at the last whatever OWASP thing it was called when we were in DC, like over the summer, last summer, I think it was last summer. I don't timeline. Maybe it was the fall. I can't even remember. But within say the last 9 months, I was in DC for sure, doing running a booth for dry run and all that fun stuff. Anyways, Jeremy gave a talk there where he said, or where he showed that obviously SAST tools or tools in general are geared towards not the test suite. And he actually showed like having basically implanting malicious backdoors through unit tests, through testing content, files, whatever, um, which was pretty neat. And but it's like, in your head, you're like, okay, cool, that's awesome. It's viable. Don't know how often it occurs, and then something like this happens. You're like, oh yeah, there you go.
Yep. Yep.
There's an example.
There it is. I found it. That's the PDF of the presentation from Jeremy, right? But it is reflections on trust in the software supply chain, right? Like we have this trust, we have these backdoors that are coming in from a unit test perspective. When we build those in the supply chain, that's what we do is we actually run the tests to see whether or not it's passing in order to determine whether or not we should build it, right? And so it's kind of this natural place for someone to insert something like this, right? Like, oh, it explodes this XZ object, and then while it's exploding it, it's actually running, the backdoor that's included in it, and trying to Lato to establish that beachhead. Um, anyway, it's an
Yeah.
interesting trust watering hole style attack. The fact that it's so public is what's interesting about it, and we can retrace what's actually going on. So if you haven't
Well, yeah,
read that article. What were you going to say?
pretty widely used protocol here. So in software programs. So yeah, it's fairly interesting for sure. Still cracks me up that just like not updating the fix. But anyways, cool. Yeah, thanks for the breakdown on that one too, because I honestly, like I said, lots happened in the last couple weeks, and nice to kind of catch up on how that all went, or what went down with that one.
Yeah. Oh crap! And he's got a link in here too. Now you've got me looking at Jeremy's talk. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a good one.
interesting. He's got a malicious dependencies repo in there that actually does some analysis. Um, huh. Anyway, okay. Well, I haven't dug into that, so I'm not going to speak to it quite yet. Cool. We've probably got, I know we started a little bit late today. You want to talk about, yeah, I don't know. Where do you want to go from here? Do you want to talk about, we talked about bounce. Do you want to talk about package hallucination or like AI package
Yeah,
hallucinations?
yeah.
Um,
Let's talk about that from Lasso Security.
okay. All right. I'm going to
And
post that one
I
here.
mean, I can give a summary of what I've read so far on, or what I've grokked so far from this article. So
Okay.
essentially, the idea is that, man, and I'm going to have to break down some things here about LLMs and all this stuff. But anyways, basically, someone, let's imagine you're an engineer and you go to ChatGPT and you ask like, what package would best, um, which package should I use to do XYZ things in my software or in my application? Well, in some cases, there were complete hallucinations. When I say hallucinations, they were fabrications of package names, package names that didn't exist. The idea being, as a summary of this whole entire article, is like, imagine if you were able to get people to believe that they need to install a package and a certain package that didn't exist, and you took over that namespace, and now you're distributing the thing that ChatGPT told people, or whatever else. I think he said ChatGPT, Gemma. I can't remember the other LLMs used, but tested a few of the popular ones that you can chat with, essentially. And
Bard and Cohere, right? Looks like. So anyway, go ahead.
yeah, no, and I think at the end of the article mentions or shows some examples of where these fake packages names actually ended up in readmes, or as like, yeah, we use this. So yeah. So anyways, I thought it was interesting, but I wanted to like break down a couple things. So first of all, like, I'm still not sure I love the term hallucinations. This is just a guessing machine, essentially a really smart guessing machine.
Mhm.
Um, if you we talked about in the course when we were explaining settings, we were explaining like temperature, top P, top K, distance between tokens, clusters of more likely to be the correct answer versus others, temperature, which allows for, essentially creativity and um, more variance in the response. These are all configurable options, right? But when you go to a chat interface, typically, right, those aren't things you've configured. These are things on the back end that have been
Yep.
highly tuned, from the prompts to the settings to everything else. Right. So that's a bit difficult because there's not much you on your end can really do other than vet that the information coming back is correct information, which you absolutely should do, obviously, especially with something as important as that. But I get frustrated sometimes when I read like LinkedIn or I read certain articles where I'm just like, the amount of mis yeah, I guess misunderstanding. Misunderstanding around LLMs is, I don't know if it's always like accidental ignorance or willful ignorance, or it's got something like someone has a bend behind it, like some vested interest in shooting down. But like, you need to, I keep saying it, but you need to temper your expectations. You need to know how to
Yep.
use this technology for specific things. And what we're seeing is like, and I think in this article and in this case, it's the right amount of like, yeah, this is a clear problem. It's somebody going into something that's supposed to answer questions, somewhat correctly, uh, or correctly. And instead, what you're getting is, fake package names that don't exist. So don't get me wrong. Like, I totally love this article. I actually think it's really good research. I think it's a very interesting attack vector. So that is not what I'm commenting on at all. This is a great article, great research. What I mean is just like, a lot of security people have not spent the time digging in hard, and I know it because I see the articles or I see the comments on LinkedIn, and I'm like, no, that's yes, but no. Yes, but no. You need to know how. Again, you need to know how to use it. Which LLM to use. Like, for example, in our course, we show people how to use generative AI, but we use Code Llama, and the reason we use Code Llama is that you can run it locally with OLLAMA. But as every student experienced, and as we explain, this is probably one of the worst, not the worst, but it's not one of the best LLMs. It has a very small context window. It doesn't necessarily understand the difference between context and anything else. It's hard to do, almost impossible to do few shot prompting properly, especially in an 8K token context window. Whereas when
Mhm.
you look at like some of the newer models, like the bigger versions of Gemma or Claude from Anthropic, or any number of these ones that have 100 to 200K context windows and accurately understand the difference between, say, context, your questions, your different prompt templates, your few shot prompt templates, your whatever other, like if you want to do like rag bits where you do like similarity searches for like a perfect example would be like, hey, I saw this function and now I need to know, where's that function defined, and doing a similarity search in the code base that you vectorized to be like, oh, here's the function name that matches, here's the top documents that match it, here's the source, the metadata source, like the file it came from, and all that fun stuff. Um, so we start off with a very basic, kind of crappy LLM, frankly, and a very basic technique, and then you sort of evolve from there. What you find is as you get to these better LLMs, when you start using, like I said, a number of different techniques, um, prompt engineering, few shot prompting, RAG, um, whatever else, techniques you're using to inform the LLM, then things start to get, and you got to ask the right questions, right? Like if you overload it, another thing that's really funny is people are like, oh, I didn't answer this correctly. It's like, well, yeah, how many questions did you ask? And you're like, oh, I just one. And you break down that question. You're like, no, that's actually three questions. That's three questions
Yep.
you're asking right there. And so, anyways, like, I don't know, having spent the better part of the year, maybe not a year, but pretty decent proportion of the year, uh, what feels like all the time in these things, I can tell you, like, it's just kind of weird. Like, there's just a lot of people claiming things that just aren't true. I've even seen people say, oh, you can't do code reviews with LLMs. It's absolute nonsense. You absolutely can. You absolutely can. You just need to know how to do it right. And that takes time to really get engaged with these different LLMs, with the different techniques, with the different tool chains, with the ecosystem. Really spend a lot of time in there, and then you'll find what it's valuable for and what it's not. So
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I just went on a rant, but it's just like, I think I'm getting to the point where I read a lot of this stuff. Not this article. Again, this article is great. What I mean is all the other, like, you can't do this, or it's, look how crazy it is, or look how it hallucinates. It's like, yeah, all right, I get it, but you don't. So, anyways, that's
Well,
me
and I
being a
mean,
little
this comes
little
down to
like
it. Like,
whatever.
I've been I've been talking with people in like the GRC, like the risk space, like trying to advise clients on, and I'll give it, Kiston over at Atreides, right? Like she's awesome. But we've been having a discussion on, this idea of like validating what's coming out of LLMs and what sort of risk people are taking on organizations specifically when they start to trust, uh, you know, an inherently non-deterministic system to answer deterministic questions, right? Like
Right.
I need a specific answer. I'm not going to go ask, a voodoo doctor or whatever it is. Like healthcare, like is one of those big places, right? Like, do I really want an LLM, having like creativity when it's trying to answer a question on whether or not a scan shows something, right? Like, no, right? Like the answer to that question is no, but we have organizations that are like starting to use AI to help in that process. And then on the flip side, right, like the practitioners and the way that we like train an LLM and have an LLM actually start to talk about these things, it comes across as if it is an expert system because that's the behavior we have told it we want, right? And
Yeah.
so like in this example specifically, right? We scroll up and we ask it like, how do we do something? And if it comes across and says, this is how you do it, and gives you code snippets saying, like, where was it in the article? I was just looking at it, right? Like, oh, yeah, how do I upload a model to Hugging Face? And it says, install these 2 packages, gives you the ability to copy the code and just drop it straight in there. What are you going to do? You're going to copy it and put it straight in because you're trusting it and it's coming across as if it is an expert system. And like, granted, if you go to OpenAI, they're going to tell you, well, you shouldn't trust the LLM, right? Like, you should validate everything. But most people don't get that message. And so we have this weird disconnect of what is the data that's coming back and how should we be interpreting it, and how far should we trust it? And so, like, I mean, I'm having
that's my
discussions on
point,
both
right?
sides, right? Yeah.
This is broad. This is a broad set of questions to an overly inundated system that is, this is what happens, right? This is exactly what happens. And if you decide to use it in this way, that's a risk. And that's not a fault of the developer, because like we are
No.
actually Copilot, like we're saying, like, use Copilot, which is integrated with OpenAI, right? I mean, that's what it is.
Yeah.
And then, ChatGPT, the idea is you're supposed to be able to answer questions and get reasonably accurate answers back. And sometimes this happens. And so I agree. I think this is a significant issue. I think it's a real problem. And it's not the way that I would use an LLM in any way, shape, or form. And like, to your point about healthcare, if I needed a very specific thing and I needed it to be repeatable all the time,
Yep.
and it was based off of some level of creativity, then yeah, like if it's that's going to be problematic, right? It depends on the use case. But if we're talking about saying, can you, within a probabilistic way, reasonably assign patient records, and then you start giving it examples of classifications of patient records, and then you start giving it more and more accurate prompt guidance, and you start getting more discrete, and maybe you're using multiple passes with your prompts, and you start, start really digging down into specific kind of categories of things, giving the LLM everything it needs, and you might get to a percentage now where it's incredibly high. We're in the 90s, maybe high 90% of accuracy, and as it's classifying things, that's a good case. That's what it's meant for, is some level of
Yep.
probabilistic analysis. What it's not meant for is to ask a question that's very like, I have an ankle that hurts, what should I do? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like, well,
exactly.
how am I supposed to answer that with any, even as a human, how am I supposed to answer that with any reasonable level of accuracy?
Well, yeah, it's the expectation that it's magic, right? Like that, it just knows. And I mean, yeah, you and I know this,
Yeah,
but I mean, this
feels
is
like
a good
magic.
example of it, right? Like, of, trusting the LLM further than you probably should. And that, but there are people that are doing that, right? Like, you know, that's the danger, right? Like, and that's where we start to get articles where it's like, oh, AI is complete, like, it's complete nonsense. No, no, it's just being used incorrectly, right? Like, you got to take it with a grain of salt, and you got to learn how to actually do it. And then on the risk side, you've got to evaluate your ability to, like, your organization's ability to actually handle something that is non-deterministic, and whether or not it's appropriate for what you want to do. And so those are the discussions I've been having with Kisten on the other side is, hey, how do we actually train people to do this? Or how do we, like, instruct an organization whether or not, this is an applicable technology for the question that they're trying to ask, and whether or not they have an appetite for that risk. And so there's all these different angles that we're coming at these AI systems from, or these LL systems from. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, both of you and I are ranting. Go check out the article. It's interesting. I think we're going to see more and more of this sort of attack happening from a general perspective, if we're not using something that's not a little more deterministic or a little bit more trained in these spaces. Yeah. Yep.
Well, I did, before we hop off, I did want to, just because Dry Run is a sponsor and my time is a part of that as well. But also, Dry Run, Redpoint, and Impart Security are sponsors of the podcast. I did want to mention beyond the hot takes. Thanks, appreciate that. Did want to mention we released. I'll put a link in for the blog, but did want to mention that Dry Run. We did release a secrets analyzer last week to folks in our product. So like as you're submitting PRs, put that in there. As you're submitting PRs, if you commit a secret, we will find that. I know, I think GitHub does that already for public repositories. It does not do that for private repositories for free. You have to buy GitHub Advanced Security. So anyways, if you'd like to try it out, try app.dryrun.security, app.dryrun.security. You'd think I'd know that, by the way, Seth. But yeah.
I was waiting for you to give us the dev or the staging URL instead, right? Because that's probably what you use more.
To be honest with you, it's not out of the realm of possibility, frankly. But yeah, anyways, I'll tell you what's kind of shocking to me. Well, I shouldn't say shocking, but what I will say is since it went online late last week, like Friday, we've already had put it this way, it's doing its job correctly, and we know that. And wow, it surprised me. So anyways,
crap. And now I got to go check my repos to see if it actually flagged.
Yeah. Hopefully you're not committing secrets and PRs there, Seth, but
I don't think I am, but like again, all the time. Yeah. Anyway.
Yes.
Sweet, man.
But yeah, thank you also to Redpoint and also to Impart for sponsoring the happy hours and some of the podcasts. So yeah, appreciate that.
Thanks. Yep. And we'll do shout outs and readouts here in the future too. So cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. Always a pleasure. Join us on Slack or, check out absoluteappsec.com if you want to see past episodes, or youtube.com/absoluteappsec. They're all out there and listed. Otherwise, we will see everyone next week. And yeah, any final announcements? Nope.
No, but if you're at RSA, please sign up. The link is in Slack.
Yes,
and I also just hit me up if you want to. I don't know, like maybe I'll got a lot going on, but if you're at RSA, let Seth, you're there, I'm there. So just let us know and we'll hang out. Beautiful San Francisco.
Exactly. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see y'all next week. See you online.